we're going to be exploring the cranial vault view, as the calvaria of the skull has been removed and underneath is a large amount of markings and spaces. And so let's begin with just understanding our orientation. So here's the anterior side, here's the posterior side. Of course, now we're looking down or inferiorly onto this area. And let's begin first with imagine yourself as shrinking yourself down into a small person. So let's start in what we call the anterior cranial fossa. So if you're walking around, the first thing you'll notice is you're walking along this horizontal plate. This is the horizontal plate of the frontal bone. And then you'll find that locked in here is like a big chasm. If this was removed, this would be an individual bone of the ethmoid bone or ethmoid bone. You would have to jump a chasm, but we don't have to do that because here is something what we call the cribriform plate. And this cribriform plate, if you can see closely enough, has a bunch of little holes in them. And all these little holes are called cribriform plate foramina. For some reason, I always think of a little baby just kind of hanging out here in the cribriform plate, being cooled down by these cribriform plate foramina. This is for your sense of smell and allows you to smell, actually. And right in the middle is this little kind of blade structure here. This is called the crista galli. And the crista galli, I don't know, I don't have too much to give you except that I just think of a friend named Krista and she drinks galli. I don't know. Whatever you want to do to be able to remember that. But this little point here, or this little process is called the crista galli. So far we got horizontal plate of the frontal bone. We jump into the cribriform plate, which is the whole thing here. This little kind of lock key mechanism with the cribriform plate foramina and the crista galli in the middle. Okay? What we're going to do is we're going to have to walk past here, down, 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 and as if you were to jump down, you can see if you're a little guy, you would jump down into the middle cranial fossa. But in order to do that, you have to jump over this smaller portion. You can see this line here. This is called the lesser wing of the sphenoid. And the lesser wing of the sphenoid kind of hangs off here and extends back here into these little kind of prominences. These are what we call the clinoid processes, both right and left. Here also you can see a little hole. This is the optic canal where you would send your eyeball through, or the optic nerve to your eyeball. And in order to jump down, you'll notice that you kind of bounce around in here. This is the whole thing. If you were to kind of imagine yourself sitting down, sticking your hands through the optic canal and then leaning your back against this kind of saddle-like substance. This whole thing, what we call, is the sella turcica. Sella meaning saddle, turcica meaning Turkish. Not necessarily that specifically is Turkish or Turkey-like, but it's named as a Turkish saddle. If I were to lean back, you'll find this huge, like the backrest of the sella turcica being what we call the dorsum sella. You can see that very clearly on CT scans and other things like that. And you'll find the two ends here that kind of peek up. These are the posterior clinoid processes. So if these are the anterior, then these are the posterior clinoid processes. And then the place where you would actually sit, this is what we call the hypophyseal fossa. And this is where the pituitary gland is going to rest. All right, so we jump down here, and then all of a sudden now we're in the middle cranial fossa. We're going to kind of roll around like as if you jumped and then you tripped and you flew around and you're like, whoa! Well, that gives me the acronym ROLS, R-O-L-S, and that helps me to know all these foramen. You can see these foramen here. See this little guy, this little guy here. This is what we call the foramen rotundum, round rotundum, and then we go to the foramen ovale. And then through here, this is the foramen lacerum. Lacerum as in laceration. It looks like a big tear, as you can see, kind of like a tear. And that's why they call it the foramen lacerum. Jumping in there would be the carotid canal and joins with that. And then the smallest one here, this little tiny guy, is the spinosum, foramen spinosum. So we got the R-O-L-S. So it kind of makes R-O-L-S. S is the smallest one. And so we kind of rolls around. R-O-L-S gives me the acronym for all these things. So that's what we have in this area, the middle cranial fossa. If you were to just kind of climb up, you'll find this area being like a big jagged rock. This is what we call the petrous portion, or petrified. I always think petrous is rock-like, or Peter, you are my rock. That is the petrous portion of the temporal bone. It houses our inner ear, places where you hear and you have your balance. So you would have to jump down, whoa, into then the posterior cranial fossa, and you would find yourself jumping over a hole, as you can see here. This hole, this is called the internal acoustic meatus, or internal auditory canal. But this is where cranial nerve number 7 and 8 will come out of. So down here, or go into, sorry. Down here now we are in the posterior cranial fossa. We have this big gigantic hole called the foramen magnum, as if somebody just blew a hole with a Magnum 44 right here. That is the foramen magnum, not the biggest foramen in our body, but still a foramen. And then you can see this larger foramen as well. This larger one is called the jugular foramen. All right, and then of course we have the internal occipital protuberance with the internal nuchal line. You can see those there, and then the occipital crest here. That's what we have. And then of course these are the posterior cranial fossa. As I said, if you're a little guy, you would jump from the anterior to the middle to the posterior cranial fossas, and we have all these different structures. Let's review really quickly. Horizontal plate of the frontal bone with the cribriform plate with the Christogalli cribriform plate foramina. Jump here. This is the body of the sphenoid. Jump over the lesser wing onto the greater wing, which is the larger portion here. All encompassing right here with this sella turcica that has the culinary processes anterior and posterior with the hypophyseal fossa and the dorsum sella. You have the middle cranial fossa with the foramen rotundum, ovale, and lacerum, and foramen spinosum. And then you jump over the petrous portion of the temporal bone that has the internal acoustic meatus right here into the posterior cranial fossa with the foramen magnum. And then we got the jugular foramen here, and then the occipital crest, and then the internal occipital protuberance with the internal nuchal lines.